Percabeth, Royal Alternate Universe Fanfiction Part 10. Prince Percy, he said, doing the same old song and dance all over again. This time, the princess stared at his hand, and then at him, and then back at his hand. "You're bored," she said dryly, reading him quickly. Percy stepped back in shock, mouth flying open to babble some sort of excuse. He must have been looking awfully miserable for her to pick up on it. What a shame, Percy thought. He thought he was really hiding it well. The princess laughed a bit, waving off any apology that was about to sprout from his mouth. Don't be worried about it," she said easily. "I've been doing this for a while too," she sighed, a long-standing suffering sigh. "You get pretty sick of it all, sooner or later," she mumbled out. Percy hated it, but he had to agree. The princess waved her arms around in the air a bit. Yeah, you get me. Rachel, by the way, since I cut off your advisor before they could introduce me," the red-haired girl said, putting a hand out for him to shake. "Percy, but you already know that," Percy said. She laughed a bit, walking down through the river. "So, how long have you been doing this whole thing?" Rachel asked, swinging her arms through the air. 3-ish months, give or take. I've met a lot of princesses," he shrugged. "Most of them I barely even had an actual conversation with, though." Rachel nodded. "Well, no offense, but I have you beat. 6 months. Not very fun," she said, running a hand down her face. Percy looked at her in surprise. "Half a year? That was a lot of time doing that whole thing." "Wow, no wonder you're sick of it," Percy chuckled. Rachel threw her arms up in the air. Yeah, no hurt to you, but it is awful. This entire thing is just so awful and annoying," she cried out. Now, for some obvious reason, Percy just had to agree with her. "And bushy," he added. Rachel groaned. "Very," she said dryly. "It's always marriage. I have other interests. Hobbies, even. I have other talents than sitting on a throne and popping out babies," she cried out, aspirated. Rachel continued to rant, finally letting go of some of her anger at the royal duties in life. Just make it a democracy. Why not? I'd be perfectly fine with that. I have no interest in these fine wines or parties that we throw." She buried her face in her hands. "Your kingdom, at least, has some real substance. Best power exchange means your kingdom is one of the best. Good working knowledge of the sea and water markets and all of that encompasses it, like civilian royalty connections. You have a respectable kingdom. Mine is just known for being rich and throwing parties from resources. It's humiliating, really. Who wants to be a part of that?" Rachel said, throwing her hands in the air. Wearily, she looked back at him. "Sorry, sounds awful." "I know, I really shouldn't be complaining," Rachel said with a huff. Percy shook his head. From what he was hearing, at least, Rachel's point of view made sense. She wasn't angry over trivial things. She was angry that all her family cared about was trivial and vapid things. If Annabeth was here, she'd nudge him and say this was a testament to her character. His heart totally didn't ache from suddenly missing Annabeth's presence. "You just want to be a part of something bigger, right?" Percy asked with a kind smile. Rachel huffed out a laugh. "Do I ever? I want to do some good. Change the world, help people, save people. You know what I mean? I don't want to be a party princess. I want to make a real difference. No one else wants to, though. They're all fine with being rich and powerful with no sense of reality. Well, I'm not blind like that. I can see through the facade." Rachel dropped her skirt back to the ground. It touched the barely solid dirt and began to soak up the water from the river in quick motions. My parents would shriek at this, she said quietly. Anyone else in my kingdom would be happy to own this dress. It would be not only something nice to wear, but something to keep warm with in the winter with the amount of layers. Percy looked at Rachel. She seemed so fiery, so out there and proud. He appreciated that, for sure, but right now she seemed so trapped, tortured, even, because she knew beyond what her family and peers knew. No one else saw the things she did, and it took a toll on her. I get that, Percy told her. Rachel raised a brow at him. Really? She said, surprised. Percy nodded. Nobles, they act like that. Drive me up the frickin' wall. My family's great about people in our kingdom, but the nobles seem to forget that they aren't above it all. They have a tendency to undermine Annabeth because she's young, and because we don't really know where she's from. Well, okay, he knew now, but he didn't really want to tell a stranger before Annabeth knew herself where she came from. It really makes me want to punch them, no matter how improper that is, Percy admitted. Rachel laughed. If you ask me, I say go for it. Her red hair bounced in the air as she hopped across the log bridge. Her balance wobbled slightly, but before Percy could reach out with a hand to help her, she stabilized herself and got across without a fuss. Nobles and privileged princes are awful, and I should know. I was born into a family of them. She snickered at her own awful joke. Annabeth's your overseer, right? She asked. Percy nodded. She's smart, Rachel commented. Scary, too. Sure, your life is all put together because of her. As much as he wanted to say that his life was better because of Annabeth, full stop, that really was not the time to say at this. That was really not the thing to say at this time. He felt like that would not be a good idea. Yep, manages everything. Does anything. She could run a kingdom by herself and knows it too. Couldn't ask for a better overseer. Percy mused. He couldn't have asked for a better best friend either. She's quite pretty too, Rachel commented, picking up a branch from the ground. Percy blushed. Yeah, well, Annabeth was gorgeous. He knew that very well. Yeah, he croaked out, hoping Rachel didn't notice. Luckily, she didn't seem to have. I know they don't pick overseers by appearance, but God forbid whoever picked mine, because they are blind as ever. But she really looks like an overseer. Powerful, regal, wise, no nonsense. Rachel listed. And your age. I bet that's fun. Mine's some old grand lady who goes on and on about party manners, as if that's the most important part of my day. She rolled her eyes with a scoff. Yeah, it's pretty nice, Percy said, scratching the back of his neck. Nice. Nice couldn't even cover it. It was quite literally, a dream come true. And one Percy couldn't even imagine not living, which was crazy to say. She always understood everything he was going through, all of his thoughts and feelings, and yet was mature and rational enough to get him out of the messes he found himself in. And she always gave the best hugs. They were warm and comforting, and he loved melting into them. There were many a times that Percy had whined and whined until she sighed in annoyance and wrapped her arms around him, and that was all before he realized he was madly in love with her. Now he laughed at those past memories. God, how the heck was he so stupid? How could someone not fall in love with Annabeth? She was so perfect. Curly hair, the brightest smile that was so rare. Percy's insides melted every time she aimed one at him. She had witty humor and the most brilliant mind. Lucky you. Mind if I borrow her for a day? Rachel teased while picking up leaves and scattering them around. Percy bit back the "don't you dare" and other mildly possessive phrases that threatened to spill. Instead, he opted to shrug nonchalantly, although he wasn't sure it looked like that. Maybe? Is she engaged? Percy choked. Rachel stared at him with eyebrows furrowed in worry. Reaching a hand over, she patted him on the back. No, Percy finally said, though thoroughly embarrassed. He was just so shocked that Rachel had asked that. And the idea, oh God, that idea? That was one he did not want to entertain. It made his heart clench with jealousy, though it was idiotic and irrational. They weren't even together. Percy just really hated the idea of Annabeth being with anyone else but him. He had never pictured her with anyone else before, and currently he can do that now, not without wanting to punch a wall, at least. Maybe two. And a crash course dummy, and whoever that awfully lucky and no doubt unworthy fool that swept her off her feet was. Rachel looked at him curiously and hummed. Strange. You'd think a girl like her would be snatched up by now. High-class job, great looks, great personality, I'm guessing. All makes for a perfect wife. You sure she's not seen anyone on the side? Rachel joked. Percy narrowed his eyes at her. You sound like you're trying to see if she's available, he shot back with a slightly guarded tone. Rachel shrugged offhandedly. So what if I'm a little bi? What's it to you? She retorted. Percy frowned. This was just wonderful. More competition for Annabeth! Well, she's not seen anyone and she's focused on her career, so she doesn't really need a relationship right now because apparently taking care of me is stressful enough, Percy said with only the slightest hint of malice. Rachel chuckled. Got it. You just want it for yourself. I certainly get that, Rachel, she said, putting her hands up in surrender. But I really am surprised that she hasn't been proposed to or anything yet. Or has she? Rachel asked, raising a questioning brow. Percy's face went dark and a large frown appeared. Oh, she had been asked for marriage before, and it was safe to say that Percy still wanted to punch that jerk. I take it she has? Rachel replied with a slightly amused tone of voice. Her fingers drummed against her sides. Percy nodded. Guy was a pretentious prick. And really, he was. A noble's son, Luke something whatever, had come to the castle with his father to request more land or mines or something that would make them more fabulously wealthy. Of course they were denied, but not before he was able to land his eyes on Annabeth as she was planning and working. It is safe to say that even to Percy it was obvious he wanted her for his wife. It was insane how irrational and angry that made Percy. For the next 3 or so weeks, Luke would come by, asking for idle things just to sneak a peek at Annabeth in her working glory. Percy would often throw glares at him, not that the blonde even noticed, because he just continued being a pompous slimeball, parading around with an unearned bravo. Even the staff was getting sick of him. It was clear no one wanted him hanging around, and at some point, he must have gotten impatient, so rather than hanging around waiting for Annabeth to fall head over heels for him, which was something that would never happen, not even in his own sick and twisted dreams, Luke took matters into his own hands and cornered Annabeth. He professed some sort of love for her, telling her that he would be happy to take her as his wife and how she would be the luckiest of them all. This speech was equally awful and embarrassing, and Percy had come so close to pulling out his sword and attacking him all defenselessly, right then and there. Annabeth had scoffed and shut Luke down so quickly. It was so funny. Percy couldn't help but laugh. Of course, Luke then launched into a huge speech about how she was stupid and missing a great chance at being his wife. Shortly after, he was kicked off the premises of the castles with an ice pack, and Percy was being reprimanded in his room by Annabeth for knocking out a citizen. That sounds awful, Rachel commented wearily. Percy shuddered with rage. I punched him, he offered with a small smile. Rachel gasped dramatically and pointed at him. Unfair, she cried out. That sounds fun. I wish I could have done that. Percy held his stomach, racked with laughter. He had to admit, it felt really good to crack his fist into Luke's face, making him fly back. Not only was he awful, but he was also 22, while Annabeth was 16. Disturbing, to say the least. It was, honestly, he said with a proud smirk on his face. Rachel laughed loudly and continued to twisting her dress skirt around. Annabeth seems really wonderful, she hummed. Percy's face flushed. Wonderful didn't cover it. Perfect barely covered it. Yes, Percy said. I guess if we do get married, I have some pretty big shoes to fill in, Rachel teased, jabbing his side with her elbow. Percy retaliated the motion. Nah, her shoes are tiny, he said offhandedly, acting as if he missed the entire point. Rachel cackled and jabbed him harder. Ow! Your elbows are pointy! Percy shouted. Rachel only cackled louder. But really, she seems really good at her job, Rachel said. Her tone of voice was suddenly nervous and serious. Percy now knew that this was no laughing matter. He smiled at her, genuinely. You run things your own way, he said, and that's not a bad thing. As much as he wanted to add on the fact that Annabeth had told him that, he refrained. It probably wouldn't help in the situation. Rachel flushed with a smile. Thanks, she said, fiddling with the hems of her dress. They were silent for a second. You know, I wouldn't hate it if we got married, Rachel admitted. Percy snorted. Not awful, not totally awful, gee. Thanks, he said sarcastically, though he didn't disagree with her. She was nice and funny and admittedly someone he could be happy with for the rest of his life. And maybe she was someone he could fall in love with, you know, if Annabeth gets married and lives far away with some lucky guy. Just saying. It would be nice. Yeah. I think it would be.